And our next talk will be given by Daniel Kaufman and Alessa Farinella. And their talk is titled here, Gesture Alignment in a Stressless Language.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks to all of you for coming to a phonology talk during AFLA. Our talk is about gesture. So first of all, Western Malayo-Polynesian languages show a ton of fascinating diversity of prosodic systems, but very few attempts have been made to account for these in a single framework. There are some generally accepted facts, though. First of all, that Philippine languages possess a contrastive stress system, or something that's been typically called a stress system, while such a contrastive stress system is extremely rare among other Western Malayo-Polynesian languages. Also, there's been a lot of discussion about Indonesian and Malay varieties, which show evidence of stresslessness, although it's also been noted that there are strong L1 effects, which temper that stresslessness. And then there's many scattered descriptions of penultimate stress patterns across the whole Western Malayo-Polynesian area. The first geographical overview was provided by the stress type database, and that served as the basis of the Walls chapter on fixed stress patterns, Goedemans and van der Hulst 2013. And that's what we're looking at now. And when you look at it, it's actually kind of a messy picture. And so first of all, the blue circles are penultimate stress, is supposed to be a fixed penultimate stress. The light blue triangles is no fixed stress. And the red dots are ultimate stress, okay? But this map and the database behind it are problematic for several reasons, for Austronesian data at least. First of all, the category of no fixed stress is problematically ambiguous here because it indicates the Philippine type system where you have a contrastive stress pattern, and it also indicates the stressless pattern of Javanese in that area. So you can see the blue triangles here and in the Philippines, but really they're completely different, almost unrelated systems. And there's also a bunch of mistakes. So for instance, Tagalog is indicated here as a penultimate, fixed penultimate stress language, which is completely wrong. And there's other such mistakes. And you don't really see much of an aerial pattern at all, right? Okay, so this was the situation as we knew it. Himmelman and Kaufman 2021 and Kaufman-Himmelman forthcoming attempt to uncover larger aerial patterns that had been previously overlooked. I won't get into the, well, I'll get into the details. So the Philippine prototype, as I mentioned, has a contrastive system, and really it's the basis of that is a vowel length distinction in the, and only in the penultimate syllable. Suffixes, but not clitics, shift length rightwards. What we call the Eastern prototype is our languages with no phonemic length or stress distinctions. You have predictable penultimate word level stress, commonly shifting to final stress if the penult contains a schwa, and suffixes and possibly certain enclitics included in the stress window. Penultimate prominence may be phrasal rather than word-based, especially in fast speech. And then we have the Java prototype where no length distinctions occur and no word level prominence at all. We do get prominence in pitch, duration, and intensity, but it's all inherited from higher prosodic levels. Effects of suffixes and enclitics on prominence are variable and difficult to discern. And finally, the least appreciated of these types is the Western rim pattern, which is really an iambic pattern that covers the Western rim of Indonesia and Malaysia, as we'll see. So I've given these cuter nicknames here, but basically we have what I would call greater iambia, and this really crosses several language families. This has been well studied in the mainland Southeast Asian languages, but less well studied in the Austronesian languages. It cuts through the Western Kalimantan and large areas of Sumatra, with the important caveat that we're talking here about lowland Sumatran languages, suggesting there's something interesting historical going on here. But the highland languages like Batak and also the barrier island languages to the west of Sumatra are not part of this iambic area. Then the Philippines is almost covers the Philippines perfectly. There's interesting exceptions in all of these areas, of course, but these are strong patterns when we look at more languages. And Trocanesia basically starts around Sulawesi and really extends far out into the Pacific, right? And that kind of makes sense because the population of the Pacific was populated, we think, from a migration around this area. But this is a very widespread pattern within Sulawesi and further east. Not very clear to what extent it holds south of Sulawesi, and I guess that's all I'll say about that. And finally, the epicenter of stresslessness is really Java, right? I won't get into this, but I think that the greater iambia and the stresslessness really are contact effects. So I think that what we see here is really the effect of a kind of Austroasiatic substrate in this area. We know that languages that show a very clear iambic pattern, like Achenese, have a ton of Mon Khmer vocabulary, for instance, and so there's other evidence like that in Kalimantan. And the stresslessness epicenter really overlaps very closely with the Indianized kingdoms and heavy Indian influence and the retroflex consonants that were probably borrowed from those languages. Okay. Moving along, if I'm able to. Okay, so Malay Indonesian has prompted particular interest due to claims that it lacks stress altogether. Here we're interested in looking at the question from a completely novel perspective, the coordination of manual beat gestures. What is a beat gesture and what do we expect from its timing? I hand it over to my co-author, Alessa. Take it away.
Okay, thanks. So beat gestures can you go back to the previous slide?
Oh, sorry.
Thanks. So beat gestures are a type of non-referential gesture that typically involve quick rhythmic movements with clear targets and starting and stopping points. And they do not convey meaning, so we don't expect them to be associated with the content of the utterance. And studies that have looked, increasing amount of studies are finding that there's a close temporal alignment between beat gestures and prosodic prominence. There are some decisions, though, that need to be made when looking at the alignment of gestures to prosodic prominence relating to which aspect of the speech signal and which aspect of the gesture coincide. So prosodic anchors include pitch accents and stressed syllables. Gesture anchors include the stroke, which is defined as the point of maximal effort, and peak velocity. These two require a bit of subjectivity on part of the annotator. So the majority of studies look at the apex, which is defined as the target or endpoint of movement. And in this study, we're going to be focusing on the apex as a gestural anchor, in part because it's much clearer to see really where this is located. And studies that have looked at the correlation of various aspects of the gesture to prosodic prominence found that there's a tighter correlation with the apex and prosodic prominence. So studies on the alignment of gesture, beat gestures and prosodic prominence have focused almost exclusively on languages with word level stress. So we can ask, what are the expectations for gesture alignment in stressless languages? And it turns out that there are very few studies that have addressed this question. Two of them are listed here. The first is a study on Hong Kong Cantonese by Fung and Mak. And they found that gesture was not aligned with prosodically prominent syllables, but consistently aligned to the beginning of the word. And in a study on French, another stressless language, they found that there was alignment of beat gestures with pitch accents marking the right edge of the accentual phrase, but the alignment wasn't quite as close as has been found for stress languages. And they suggest that gesture is marking boundaries of prosodic domains.
Oh, sorry. Okay, thanks. So the data we're looking at here comes from two publicly available video recordings of religious sermons. One Islamic lecture by Imam Ustad Abdul Somad, henceforth Somad, and a sermon by a pastor by the name of Nadia Manuputi Jambor Mias, henceforth Manuputi. Somad is from West Sumatra and speaks Minangkabau in addition to Indonesian, although maybe he hails from a Javanese family originally, not totally clear. And Manuputi is from Ambon in East Indonesia. Both speak regional varieties of Indonesian. It's important to note that Manuputi is not speaking what's called Ambon Malay, which is really almost a different language. It is a different language. She's speaking a Ambonese flavored Indonesian that most people would recognize very quickly as belonging to Eastern Indonesia. Why religious sermons? Well, they're very readily available on the internet, and they're highly emotive and full of gestures, right? So they're really the perfect kind of data for what we're looking at. Okay, so what are the predictions? If Malay or Indonesian are stressless, if the varieties are stressless, we expect less coincidence between gesture and particular syllables, that is penultimate or ultimate. We would expect a tendency towards higher prosodic boundaries rather than regular alignment with words. On the other hand, if Malay varieties fit the Kaufman and Himmelmann's general prosodic geography, we expect Eastern varieties like Ambon to show a trochaic pattern of gesture alignment, and Western varieties like those of lowland Sumatra to show final alignment on the word or phrase level. Okay, so the methodology, just very briefly, in the first phase, what we did was code the video without listening to the audio at all, without looking at the face or anything like that, just looking at the hands and no audio. In the second phase, the information was entered into a spreadsheet with additional information about the position of the apex in relation to the word, now listening to the audio. We notated 282 gestures for Somad, and 279 were coded for Manuputi. And then the quantitative data was subject to a basic statistical analysis in R, and the coincidences between the gestures and pitch accents were analyzed in Pratt. I won't talk much about this, but this is basically our coding system, and we looked at various factors that could influence the position of a pitch accent and presumably a manual gesture as well. So whether or not the word has a suffix, whether the word had a clitic, was it phrase final, was the gesture aligned to a schwa, was there a penultimate schwa in the word, and was it a function word? We took those based on what we know about pitch accents to be potentially relevant for gesture as well. Okay, so this is a kind of slow motion example. It's very, it looks janky if I try to play an actual video, but I slowed this down. Rather, I took it frame by frame to show you what the kind of data we're looking at. So this is a sentence, itu berarti bahwa kualitas hidup dan keimanan. That means that the quality of life and faith, and you can see it moving along here, if I can get it to do that. So this is, it's kind of still janky, but you can see as I move it slowly, the coincidence between the pitch accents in the blue, which represents the pitch track, and on the bottom tier there, you see the B, which represents the apex of the gesture. That's also indicated with the arrow in the video. Okay, so that's itu berarti, and then nothing, 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 function word, and then kualitas, again, the apex of a beat gesture, coinciding with a giant pitch accent. Hidup, a smaller pitch accent coinciding with the apex of a beat gesture. And finally, the last word, also containing a high pitch accent coinciding with a beat gesture. In each case here of the four, it's falling exactly on the penultimate syllable. And what we find is really that, to our surprise, the coincidence not only between gesture and pitch accent, but both to the penultimate syllable in the Eastern variety was like clockwork, really, with a few exceptions that we'll discuss, but very, very close. Okay, so I just wanted to briefly cover the kind of most salient or impressionistically most salient points from both varieties. So now just looking at the same Eastern variety, we find word-based alignment. So this is ini soal bagaimana konsistensi orang tua untuk hadir. And again, I've highlighted the pitch accent, I'm sorry, the location of the apex of the beat gesture in the red box. And as you see, it coincides every time with a pitch accent. And that both of those coincide with the penultimate syllable in these words. Here it's, word, 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 and here it's one gesture for the entire phrase, orang tua untuk hadir. Okay, so looking at this, we see that it's not at all what we might expect for a stressless language. It's very much word-based, right, as opposed to phrase-based in this variety. We also notice that the suffixes are pretty consistently integrated in this variety, although there's exceptions. So if you look at meletakkan, now the gesture falls on the still the penultimate syllable of the word, but this ends up being the final syllable of the root. And that's because the suffix is pulling the prominence to the right. In the two verbs at the end, where you have no suffix, it's falling on the penultimate syllable of the root, which is also the penultimate syllable of the word. Mengajar dan mendidik. And we also get integration of clitics, although this is less consistent, I think. So we have here, their nation is also strong. And the nya here, which is really a clitic, is still pulling the prominence to the right. Bangsanya juga kuat. Again, you get a pitch accent and apex of a beat gesture. You do get exceptions. And for whatever reason, this word in particular, didik, educate, maybe because of some kind of paradigmatic effect, ends up always being, the prominent syllable always ends up being on the penultimate syllable of the root, regardless of suffixes. So this is education, and it's not pendidikan, it's pendidikan. But still, the pitch accent and the beat gesture coincide, even though it's not, it's anti-penultimate rather than penultimate. Okay. Again, more evidence that this is word-based. When you get reduplication, the mulai dari bilik-bilik, it was started from the rooms. You get two pitch accents and two gestures, which really, I think, very clearly shows that we're not dealing with a phrasal category here, but rather a word-based category. And we get pretty consistent schwa avoidance here. So here we have where the penultimate syllable has a schwa in it, it shifts to the final syllable and it takes the beat gesture with it. So this is pandemic ini. Function words seem to be exceptional, and that kind of relates to what's been said in the literature, that at least by, I think, a recent paper by Alex Smith shows that function words in some Indonesian varieties or languages have final prominence, where content words have penultimate prominence, and that may explain some exceptions here. So those are the most salient points from the Eastern variety. Let me move now to the Western variety. This is our friend Imam Somad, banging a book on the table. Okay, yeah. Most prominently, we find final lengthening here, which I really think is the phonetic feature that underlies greater iambia. Okay, and you can see it very clearly here. Tiru, and I've indicated the lengthening with this arrow. Yang dibuat malam ini, you get lengthening here and lengthening here. And this is really, I think, also perceptually what lead people to identify a variety as being Sumatran. Okay. Yes, this is a very good example of that. Reski. So this is, one has wealth, one has money, a long life, a healthy body, and doesn't want to sacrifice. Reski ada, duit ada, umur panjang, badan sehat, tak mau berkorban. And you get a lot of lengthening here and the coincidence of a beat gesture in every case. Okay, but you do have exceptions, right? This is not exceptional. Alessa will talk about the exceptions in a minute. And it seems that this variety is more phrasally aligned than word aligned, although that's still pending because we haven't really run a quantitative analysis on the pitch accents yet. But in any case, smaller domains are still possible here with emphasis, right? And one of the reasons we chose this is because it's emphatic speech. And so you do get final lengthening even in cases like this. So the pink syllables here are where the gestures are aligned, and in almost all cases, even when the vowel is short, the final vowel is double the length or more of the penultimate vowel, which is really, I think, again, the hallmark of the Western prosody. Another thing is that these varieties don't really make a difference, it seems, between functional and content words. So function word here, saja only, you get quite massive final lengthening and the coincidence of a beat gesture. This would not happen, I think, in the Eastern varieties. Finally, you get variation here. So even within a single utterance or an adjacent utterance, you get things like the different integration of clitics. So this is eat. So he says makanlah, and the beat gesture is here. And then right after that or before it, he has this fall, rise fall in the first syllable, but it's the second syllable that really is more prominent and gets the beat gesture. So in one case, it seems to be including the clitic in the window of prominence, and in the other case, it's not. So it's makanlah, makanlah. And this is true for this case as well, where he's talking about an Arabic word, kulu. What does kulu mean? And in the first instance of kulu, final prominence, and the second one, penultimate prominence. Okay, let me race through this. And here we are back to Alessa to talk about the quantitative side.
So for the quantitative analysis, we're just looking at the alignment of beat gestures to syllables, setting aside pitch accents for now. So we had 237 gestures for Somad, the speaker of the West Sumatran variety, and 265 gestures for Manuputi, the speaker of the Ambanese variety. So these plots just show the proportion of alignment by the various syllable positions out of the total gestures for each speakers. So looking first at the graph on the left for Somad, we can see that there's a strong tendency toward final alignment, about 80% of the total. And then looking at the graph on the right for Manuputi, the same thing, we find instead that there's a strong tendency for penultimate alignment, again, almost 80% of the total. Looking now at alignment by phrase position. So this is of the total gestures, the proportion of them that fall in words that are final in the phrase compared to non-final in the phrase. So looking first at Somad, the graph on the left, what we find is that over 70% of gestures occur in words that are in the final syllable of a phrase, whereas about 30% occur in words that are non-phrase final. And looking at Manuputi on the right, we see really the mirror image of this. So only about 25% of gestures occur in words that are phrase final, whereas about 75% occur on non-phrase final words. And we can zoom in even a little closer and look at word alignment by phrase position. And so that's what we have here. So we have the proportion of phrase final gestures on phrase final words that are in the final position in the word and penultimate position, and the same for non-final gestures on non-final words. So starting first with Somad, looking at Somad, the graph on the left, we can see that there's a strong tendency for alignment to the final syllable in the word, which is what we expect based on the data so far. And we're just looking at final and penultimate alignment here, setting aside cases of anti-penultimate and pre-anti-penultimate because they make up a very small percentage of the total data, and many of them do turn out to be loan words. So for Somad, there's a strong tendency toward final alignment, and this tendency is even stronger in words that are in the final position in a phrase. So you can see that on the right. And on the left, the words that are in non-final position, there is more exception, and the difference between the proportion of penultimate and final alignment is much smaller. And a chi-squared test revealed that this was significant, that the relationship between position in the phrase and alignment of gesture to a syllable in a word is significantly correlated. If we look now at Manuputi, what we see at the graph on the right, what we see is that there's a strong tendency toward penultimate alignment, which is again what we expect based on the data so far. But there doesn't seem to be much of a difference between the phrase final and non-phrase final conditions. And this is confirmed by a chi-squared test. It really seems that the position in the phrase and the alignment of the apex of the gesture to a position in the word are independent for the speaker. So what this perhaps suggests is that prominence, which is revealed through these gestures, through alignment of gestures, is more of a word-based phenomenon for the speaker of this Ambanese variety. Whereas for Somad, it's possible that this is a phrase-based phenomenon. It's also possible that due to his speaking style, there are more phrase breaks. That's another possibility as well for the speaker. So these tendencies were not exceptionless. To look at the exceptions, we'll start with Somad. 199 tokens showed alignment of the apex of the gesture to the final syllable in the word. And so we take this to be the basic pattern. Setting aside the anti-penultimate alignment cases, we have 31 tokens with exceptional penultimate alignment, and they make up 13% of the total data for the speaker. So we looked at other factors to try and account for these exceptions, but nothing showed a strong explanation for these, not the presence of or absence of a monosyllabic clitic or presence or absence of a suffix. So we take them just to be exceptions. And looking at Manuputi now, she had 205 tokens of penultimate alignment, so we take that to be the basic pattern, and 39 tokens of exceptional final alignment. And they account for 15% of the data. So on the face of it, it looks like there's more exceptions for this speaker. However, we looked at alignment when the penultimate syllable is a schwa, and that's what you see in this graph here. On the left, these are words without a schwa on the penultimate syllable, and you can see we get the expected penultimate alignment in the majority of the cases. On the right, those are the words with a schwa on the penultimate syllable, and in about 75% of these cases, we find alignment with the final syllable. So there's a strong tendency for final alignment when the word has a penultimate schwa, and this was significant. It coincides with reports of final prominence as a strategy for Schwa avoidance in the literature on intonation. So penultimate schwa explains 25% of tokens of exceptional final alignment for the speaker. Of the remaining, 58% had alignment of the apex of the gesture to a final syllable, but the peak effort coincided with the penultimate syllable. And peak effort has also been shown to be correlated with prosodic prominence, although more weakly so. So we can view this as a different strategy for marking prominence.
Sorry.
So that leaves just less than 6% unexplained exceptional final variation. Sorry.
Okay, we've gone over time, but let me just very quickly, the conclusions. We've shown that beat gestures follow regular prominence patterns and the gesture apexes are closely coordinated with pitch accents in very distinct and distant Indonesian varieties. Both varieties show consistent patterns that could be roughly described as trochaic versus iambic. Ambonese Indonesian appears to have a strong word-based trochaic pattern as manifested both by pitch accents and manual gestures. West Sumatran Indonesian appears to have a strong final syllable prominence pattern as expected by the Western Rim prototype. And we didn't talk about this, but we also see further phonologization of the prosodic word in the Eastern prototype when compared to the Western area. And even within the Eastern area, there's different levels of phonologization. So you wouldn't find the kind of variation we see in the Ambonese variety in the languages of most languages of Sulawesi, for instance, where certain clitic or all suffixes are included in the stress windows, certain clitics are included, other clitics are excluded. There's variation across languages, but very little variation within a language. Okay, we'll leave it at that in case there's time for questions. Thanks.
Great, thank you both. We do have a few minutes for questions, so please feel free to raise your hand or type it into the chat. Christine has a question.
Yeah, hey, I think this was super interesting to look at the beat gestures as a way of looking at prominence and phrases. So one thing I'm not entirely sure if I just missed was in the quantitative analysis, did you show us like how often a word, so each word, let's say, is potentially a site in which you could get a beat gesture. What percentage of words were getting beat gestures? I wasn't quite sure if I just missed that. Like, it looked like your analysis showed of the words that got beat gestures, what happened?
Yeah, that's an important statistic that we don't have yet. So we need to do a word count, and we also need to do, I would like to show that as well as the total number of pitch accents, which we haven't really annotated yet thoroughly. So that's an important piece of data that's not there yet. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, because there's different predictions, like Alessa mentioned. it's possible that certain differences among this have to do with the speaking style. So Mad is also seems to be breaking up phrases into, or let's say breaking up utterances into many more prosodic phrases than is Manuputi. So things like that have to also be accounted for. So yeah, we just haven't done that yet.
Yeah, so I was just curious because like I'd be, so are some of these related to, pragmatic sites for prominence and then are those then possible sites that then look at where they put the prominence? And so yeah, those are some things I was wondering.
I can say that pragmatic prominence has actually been looked at quite a bit, relatively speaking, in Indonesian, and they're really, so the kind of the accepted opinion is that there really is no prosody for focus, for instance, in Indonesian. Definitely, so there was experiments done whether Indonesian speakers could even perceive the kind of differences that we would make by, let's say, corrective focus on like a part of a word. Like I said, coffer, not coffin, right? Which is done, normally in Germanic languages and English. But this is not done at all in Indonesian and can't even be perceived by Indonesian speakers when hearing it in English, according to that experiment. So yeah, I mean, that's not totally true for all varieties. I mean, Stool has a whole book on focus in Manado Malay and shows that there's stuff going on there. But for the kind of stressless varieties, nobody has really cracked the code of how intonation interacts with focus at all.
Great. If there are more questions, please feel free to use the Slack channel. And we will now take another short little break before we get on to the second half of the block. But let's thank our speakers again. And we'll come back in about 13 minutes.
Thanks.